cockpit glass fogged from the inside first. That was the detail every one of them mentioned, in different words, across different years. The way the windshield went milky with condensation, while the outside air over the northern sea still read below freezing on the gauge. It should not have fogged. Warm breath meeting cold glass will do it, but not like this. Not in a sudden bloom that crept up from the lower corner and spread until a pilot had to wipe it with a gloved hand to see the horizon again. And when he wiped it, in that first account I want you to stand inside, he saw that he was not alone in the corridor. It was running alongside the aircraft. To the left and slightly below, holding the same speed as a mail plane doing perhaps 140 miles an hour into a headwind. Longer than the plane by a wide margin. The man who first tried to measure it against his own fuselage in his logbook wrote that it was 3 times the length of the ship he was flying, which put it somewhere past 130 feet from the blunt leading end to the place where it thinned and frayed away into the cloud behind them. Pale. Not white, he insisted, when they questioned him later. Pale the way the inside of a shell is pale. Pale the way a deep-sea thing is pale. A body that has never needed colour because it has never lived where light reaches. And it was segmented. That word comes up again and again in the drawings. Segmented, banded, ribbed along its length like a great translucent muscle. And through the translucence, faintly, you could see something moving inside it. A slow pulse. A travelling glow that ran head to tail and back again, warm-coloured, the amber of a lamp seen through frosted glass. It did not flap. It did not beat wings, because it had none. It rippled. It moved the way a current moves, the way a ribbon of kelp moves in a tide, the whole enormous length of it undulating through the air, as though the air over that stretch of sea were not air at all but water, and this thing had simply learned to swim in it. Now hold on to the temperature, because that is the part the men could not let go of for the rest of their lives. The moment the shape drew level, the cockpit went hot. Not warm. Hot. One pilot described loosening his flying suit at 8,000 feet over open ocean in the month of November, sweat running down his back, the cabin thermometer, the little one clipped near the compass, climbing past what he had ever seen it read on the ground in summer. The engine did not change note. The oil temperature did not spike. Nothing mechanical explained it. The heat came from outside, from the corridor itself, from the pale body pacing them, and it rose the closer the thing came, and it fell away the moment the thing drifted off. They called that corridor the warm zone, but I am getting ahead of the men who named it, and I don't want to leave this cockpit yet, because there is more that they saw, and it is the seeing that matters here. The raw physical fact of it, before anyone in an office decided what it was allowed to have been. The leading end had no face. That was said gently, almost apologetically, by more than one of them, as if they understood how it sounded. No eyes they could find, no mouth. Just a rounded, blunt, faintly luminous prow, and behind it the banded length, and along the flanks a fringe, a ribboning, a set of long trailing filaments that streamed backward in the slipstream and yet seemed to move against it, curling forward and inward in slow, deliberate waves. It held station with them for whole minutes. It matched their turns. When one pilot, gripped by something between terror and a strange courtesy, eased his aircraft a few degrees toward it, the thing eased away by exactly that much, keeping the gap, keeping the pace, keeping, and this is the word that turns my stomach a little every time I read it, keeping company. Because that is what unsettled them most. Not that it was large, not that it was strange, that it seemed aware. It travelled with them the way a dolphin travels with the bow of a ship, riding the pressure the hull throws forward, taking the free ride and the company both. Except there was no water here. There was a plane, 4,000 pounds of engine and canvas and mail sacks, grinding through cold air over a grey sea at the edge of the maps, and beside it, 130-foot translucent body glowing from within, warming the metal around the men until they sweated, pacing them, watching without eyes, present in a way the sky is not supposed to be present. And then, in that first telling, it left the way it always left in the tellings that followed. It did not dive or climb. It simply slowed relative to them, or they outran the warmth. They were never sure which, and it sank back into the cloud on their left quarter, the amber pulse dimming as the distance grew, the pale bands going grey, the fog on the windshield clearing from the corner it had crept in from, and the temperature falling degree by degree back toward the honest cold of the northern autumn, until the man was shivering in a flying suit soaked through with his own sweat, alone again over the sea, with 60 pounds of mail and no one on the radio who would believe him. He flew that route again. That is the thing you have to understand before we go any further. He flew it again, and so did the others, because it was their job, and the mail had to move, and the warm zone, for all its dread, was a smoother, faster ride than the frozen air on either side of it, a low, cloud-roofed corridor where the wind eased and the temperature climbed and the miles came quicker, and where, sometimes, on certain crossings, in certain years, the pale thing came up out of the murk to run beside them for a while. They wrote it down. That is the part I could not get past. The part that pulled me into this material for 3 weeks before I felt I had any right to a single sentence. They wrote it down in the places pilots are trained never to embroider, the logbook, the altimeter margin, the fuel and weather notes. And when you lay those pages side by side, across different men, different aircraft, a full decade of them, they are not describing a fear. They are describing an animal. They are describing where it lived, and how it moved, and what it did to the air around it. And they are describing, without ever quite daring to write the word, that the warm zone was not the weather. The warm zone was the wake of something alive. I have the pages in front of me now, or rather the photostats of them, ordered from a regional aviation records office that did not fully understand what it was sending me, and I want to walk you through them the way I walked through them, because the shape of the thing does not arrive all at once. It assembles. It builds out of 100 small, honest notations made by men who had no idea they were sketching a body between them. Start with the length. 3 of the surviving logs give a figure, and they give it in the only unit a pilot instinctively reaches for over open water, the length of his own aircraft. The mail runs of that decade were flown mostly in single-engine machines a little over 10 meters nose to tail, and again the men reached for that measure. Length of 3 ships, perhaps more, one wrote in the margin beside a fuel entry, the ink pressed hard. Another, a former naval observer who should have known better than to guess at scale over featureless sea, put it at 35 to 40 meters, paced abeam for 11 minutes. A third simply drew 2 short strokes and a long one beneath them and wrote the word compare. 3 fuselages, 30-odd meters of something that was not there, running level in cloud that no aircraft of that era could have shared with another aircraft and survived. Then the translucency. This is the detail that convinced me these men were not copying one another, because it is a strange thing to invent and a very specific thing to see. They did not describe a solid animal. They described something you could partly see through. Cloud showing faint behind the middle of it, reads one note. Not a fish belly white, a lamp behind wax, reads another. And I have read that phrase more times than I can count, a lamp behind wax, because it is not the language of a frightened man reaching for a monster. It is the language of a man trying to be accurate about a quality of light he had never seen before and would never see again. The bands of the body glowed and dimmed, they wrote, in slow waves that travelled from the leading end toward the tail, and where the glow was strongest, the cloud beyond it went gold, and where it faded, you could see the grey murk carrying on straight through the creature as though it were only a thickening of the fog itself. Segmented. That word, or its plainer cousins, appears in 5 separate hands, rings, bands, jointed like a caddis grub blown up huge. One man, and I have spent a long time on this man, was a former biology student who had left university for the money in the airmail, and his notes are different from the others, cooler, more careful, more damning. He counted the segments. He counted them on 3 separate crossings and got, on his own admission, 9, then 11, then 9 again, and he added a line I keep returning to. It is not rigid. The count changes because it flexes. It is swimming. Swimming. Through air. Beside him. He underlined the word once and never wrote about the thing again in any document I could find. Now put those drawings together, and this is where the 3 weeks went, because the drawings survive in the worst possible form. Pencil on the backs of weather sheets, on the inside covers of logbooks, one on the reverse of a mail manifest that was never supposed to leave the aircraft. They are not good drawings. Pilots are not artists. But they agree, and they agree in the particular unglamorous way that truthful witnesses agree and liars do not. Every one of them draws the same taper, blunt and heavy at the forward end, drawn out and ribboned at the rear, trailing into a set of loose filaments that 2 of the men describe as moving like weed in a tide, even in still cloud. Every one of them puts the glow in the same place, low in the body, along what you would call the belly if the thing had a belly. And every one of them, without exception, draws it longer than their own aircraft, and draws their own aircraft small and tucked up near the creature's forward third, exactly where a smaller animal rides the pressure wave of a larger one moving through a fluid. That is the detail that ended my skepticism for good, and I want to be precise about why. These men did not know fluid dynamics as we understand it. They did not have the vocabulary of bow waves and pressure fields and drafting, and yet in drawing after drawing they have placed their aircraft in exactly the position a remora takes on a shark, exactly the position a dolphin takes at the bow of a ship, riding the moving water the big body pushes ahead of itself. They reported that the flying was easier in the warm zone. They reported that the miles came faster. They were being carried. They felt it as a gift of smooth air and following wind, and they drew, without understanding what they were drawing, a large animal towing a small one through a medium. And the warmth, always the warmth, threaded through every page in the one form a pilot could not ignore even if he wanted to, the instruments. The outside air temperature notes on those crossings are wrong. They climb where they should fall. One log shows the free air reading rising through the corridor from the honest cold of the open sea to something the man recorded, twice, as shirt sleeve, with a question mark he clearly added later, in different pencil, once he'd had time to be frightened by his own handwriting. The altimeter margins carry it too, because pressure and temperature are married in that instrument, and the men had learned to distrust their altitude in the warm zone, to fly it by feel and by faith, because the needle drifted as the air around them heated from a source that was not the sun and was not the sea and was not any front on any chart. The source, they came to believe, was the thing itself. It ran warm from within. It heated the corridor it swam in. And that is why they named the corridor and not the creature, because you could measure the warmth on a gauge and write it in a log without anyone calling you mad, but you could not measure the animal, and so the animal went into the margins, into the drawings, into the strokes of pencil that compared it to 3 fuselages and a lamp behind wax. The name settled sometime around 1946. The warm zone. It moved by word of mouth first, in the ready rooms and the fuel stops, the way pilots' knowledge always moved, quietly, without ceremony, one man telling the next where the smooth air lived and what lived in it. By the late 40s it was in the written record as a place, a stretch of the route you flew or you avoided, and the men who flew it kept 2 kinds of notes, the official ones, clipped and legal, temperature and heading and fuel, and the other ones, the marginal ones, the ones with the drawings, where they let themselves say what the official column would not hold. It dwelt in the warm zone, they wrote, in their various careful ways. It came up when it chose, it ran alongside, and it looked at them. Several of them use that word, looked, though not one of them ever describes an eye, and then it sank back into the cloud and let the cold come in behind it. They were mail flyers. They were paid to carry paper across a cold sea and to write down the truth about the air. And the truth they wrote down over a full decade in a dozen hands that never met was that the warmest place on that route was a living body, and that it was aware of them. The first man I can name is Halvard Sunde, and I can name him because his logbook survived, held now in a private aviation collection in Bodø, catalogued only as an anonymous flight ledger, 1948 to 1951, water-stained along the spine. Sunde flew the Northern Mail Run 40 times that I can document, and it is his hand, small and slanted and disciplined, that gives us the first sentence I trust completely. On the 9th of March, 1949, at what he logs as 14 minutes past the hour, he wrote that the cockpit temperature climbed 9 degrees in under a minute, with the outside air holding steady at -11. 9 degrees. From nothing. No sun. No engine fault. No descent into denser air. He noted it in the official column because a temperature is allowed to be strange. And then, in the margin, in the same pencil, he wrote 3 words that I have read more times than I can count. It is here. Not a thing is here. Not something. It. He had flown the corridor enough times by then that the article was unnecessary. There was only one it, and every man on that route knew which one. What I want you to understand about these men is that they were not romantics. They were not seekers. They were employees of a postal air service operating one of the least forgiving routes in the Northern Hemisphere, and their entire professional worth rested on the accuracy of what they wrote down. A mail flyer who invented weather did not fly for long, and so when 3, 4, 6 of them, across separate years and separate aircraft, log the identical impossible event, a sudden interior warmth with no meteorological parent, arriving at the same stretch of the corridor, sometimes accompanied by that long, pale shape running level off the wingtip and sometimes not, I cannot dismiss it as one man's fancy passed down and embellished. The drawings do not match because they were copied. They match because the men were looking at the same body, and the body, they began to notice, did not simply appear. It arrived with heat, and it left cold behind it. Several of the later entries describe the sequence in the same order every time. First the smoothing of the air, the turbulence dying away as though the sea beneath had been oiled. Then the warmth, rising through the floor of the cockpit, through the soles of the boots, up into a cabin that had been rimmed with frost a minute before. Then the shape, if it chose to show itself, pacing them, translucent and faintly lit from within, 3 fuselages long and ribboned like something poured rather than grown. And then, when it sank away, the cold coming back in behind it like a door left open, a cold that felt, one man wrote, colder than the air had any right to be, as if the thing had taken the warmth of the place with it when it went down. They kept flying it anyway. That is the part I cannot make comfortable. They kept flying the warm zone because the warm zone was, by every practical measure, the safest air on the route, smooth, predictable, free of the killing turbulence that waited on either side of it. The corridor that held the creature was also the corridor that kept them alive, and so they made a bargain, the way men in dangerous trades always make bargains, and the bargain was silence and continuance. Fly the smooth air, note the temperature, draw the thing in the margin where the inspectors would not look. Do not, under any circumstances, put the word into the official column, because the word ended careers and the smooth air saved lives. Then, in the autumn of 1951, the bargain broke. 2 aircraft, flying the corridor 11 days apart, did not arrive. I have the dates from the service's own dispatch summaries, which record them flatly as failures to report, the language of an organization that does not want to write the word lost. The first was flown by a man the records give only as Eriksson, departing in conditions described by the following flight as exceptionally clear, and that word, clear, is the one that has kept me awake. Not a storm, not ice, not fog on the water, clear sky, good visibility, a serviceable aircraft, an experienced man, and then nothing, no wreckage, no oil sheen, no signal, no body. The sea took him, or something took him, and the sea, at least, usually gives back a fragment. This time, it gave back nothing at all. 11 days later, the second aircraft vanished under conditions so nearly identical that the dispatcher, in a note I have read in reproduction, wrote a single line asking whether the two events could be related, and then, in a different ink, struck the question out. Someone did not want that question in the file. But the pilots who remained knew the answer they preferred, and they gave it to each other in the ready rooms, not in writing. Both men had been warm zone flyers. Both had logged it going hot around them in the weeks before, and both had gone down out of clear air in the smooth corridor on the stretch where the warmth lived. There was one man who came back to tell it, and his is the account that turns this from folklore into something I cannot set down. I will not give his full name, because his family asked, through the collection that holds his statement, that it not be spread, but he flew the corridor into the winter of 1951 and 1952, after the two disappearances, when most of the others had already begun quietly refusing it. He described a crossing in which the temperature in his cockpit rose not by 9 degrees but by more than 20, until he flew with his collar open and sweat on his face in an aircraft crossing a frozen sea, and the shape ran alongside him for what he estimated at 4 full minutes, longer than any other logged encounter, and did not sink away. It stayed. It paced him. And he wrote, in the statement, that he understood in those 4 minutes that it was not curious about the aircraft. It was curious about the men inside it. It had learned, over a decade of flyers, where the warmth of a living body was kept, and it had come up to be near it. He landed. He was, by every account, never the same. The service grounded him within the month. For medical reasons, the record says, exhaustion, nerves, the vocabulary an organization uses when it has decided a man's truth is inconvenient. He was quietly retired before the following summer. He never flew the Northern Mail again, and when he spoke of it, decades later, to the person who took down his statement, he said only that the warm zone had been feeding on something, and that he had felt it deciding whether he was worth taking, and that he had been spared not because he escaped, but because, for reasons he could not name, it let him go. And after that the flyers stopped coming. Not by order, not by any grounding of the route. One by one they simply requested other assignments, took the longer crossings through the rough cold air, chose the turbulence that could kill them honestly over the smooth warmth that chose its own. By the middle of 1952, there were almost no volunteers left for the corridor, and a route is only a route as long as men are willing to fly it. The warm zone did not close. It was abandoned. The pilots thinned themselves out of it, one refusal at a time, and left the warmth to whatever had been keeping it. And here is where the erasure begins, and I want you to notice how gentle it is, how reasonable, how nearly invisible. Nobody burned a file. Nobody sealed a vault. What happened to the warm zone is the quietest kind of disappearance there is, the kind that happens when an explanation arrives that everyone would prefer to be true. The first paper I can find that names the corridor without believing in it is a 1953 aviation weather bulletin out of the Northern Postal Directorate, and it uses the phrase localized thermal inversion for the first time in connection with the route. There is no drama in it. There is a diagram of warm air trapped beneath a colder ceiling, an arrow, a temperature gradient, a footnote, and in that footnote, the entire decade of statements, the drawings, the altimeter notes, the 4 minutes, the 2 men gone into clear sky, is folded down into a single sentence about anecdotal crew reports consistent with disorientation in low visibility warm layer conditions. That is how you make a creature vanish. You do not deny it. You reclassify the men who saw it. Over the next 60 years, I can watch the language harden. In the 1950s, it is a thermal inversion. In the 1960s, in a training memorandum I found reprinted in a flight safety compendium, it becomes The warm zone effect, a known hazard of the abandoned corridor, useful now only as an example for cadets of how heat and fatigue can conspire to produce false perceptions. By the 1970s, an academic paper on aviation psychology, I have the off-print, the pagination runs 411 to 419 dies, cites the Northern Mail flyers by name, anonymized to initials, as a textbook cluster of shared occupational hallucination, the warmth explained as engine bleed, the pale shape explained as a reflection of the aircraft's own belly on the cloud deck, the deaths explained as spatial disorientation, and the survivor, my survivor, the man who flew with his collar open and felt it deciding, described in a single clause as a subject presenting with confabulatory recall following operational stress. Confabulatory recall, that is the phrase they used to bury him. It means he made it up and believed it. It is the vocabulary an organization reaches for when a man's truth is inconvenient. And I told you at the start of this that I would show you how a thing gets erased without a conspiracy. And this is it. This is the whole machine. No one lied. Every author in that chain was doing careful, sober, defensible work. Each of them simply chose the explanation that required nothing further of them. And the thing about that choice is that it compounds. Once the warm zone is a thermal inversion in one bulletin, the next author cites the bulletin, not the flyers, and the flyers recede by 1 degree, and the author after that cites the citation, and by the third generation of paper, the men are gone entirely, and only the weather remains, tidy and cold and fully explained. And I have to be honest with you now, because I have been honest the whole way, and the strongest version of their case deserves to be spoken in full and not caricatured. Here it is. A cloud-warmed corridor over a frozen sea is exactly where you would expect a thermal inversion to form. Warm air riding above cold water, trapped under a colder ceiling. That is real meteorology. It happens. It is not invented. A pilot flying for hours into a low, bright, featureless warm layer is a textbook candidate for disorientation. The horizon vanishes, the inner ear lies, the temperature climbs from bleed air and adrenaline and a closed cockpit, and the mind, starved of reference, builds a shape out of the reflection of the aircraft on the cloud below. Pilots do share hallucinations. Isolated crews on repeated routes do converge on the same imagery, the same story, the same monster, because they talk to each other, because they read each other's reports, because fear is contagious and specific. And men do die in disorienting conditions, and the mind of a survivor does reshape a trauma into a narrative it can carry. Every single piece of it fits. I have sat with this explanation for a long time, and I want to tell you plainly, I find it persuasive. It accounts for the warmth, it accounts for the shape, it accounts for the shared drawings. It very nearly accounts for everything, but it does not account for the timing. A thermal inversion is a feature of air and water and season. It does not care who flies through it. It does not thin itself out because men grow afraid. And yet the warm zone cooled. That is the fact the meteorology cannot hold. The temperature logs along that corridor, which I traced through the postal weather records into the middle of the decade, show the anomaly weakening season by season across exactly the years the flyers were abandoning the route. Not after the climate shifted, not after any front or current changed, but in step with the refusals, as though the warmth had a reason to be there and the reason was leaving. An inversion does not fade because its witnesses stop coming. Something that is being fed does. And that is the sentence I cannot walk back. No matter how many sober papers I read, the warmth went out of the sky at the same rate the men went out of it, and the last strong reading, the last genuinely hot pass through the corridor, is dated within weeks of the last volunteer. So I am left with the survivor's words, which no bulletin ever refuted and no paper ever answered, because you cannot refute a thing you have decided is confabulation. He said it had learned where the warmth of a living body was kept. He said it had come up over 10 years of flyers to be near it. And if he was right, even a little right, then the abandonment of the route was not an escape. It was a starvation. The men did not close the warm zone. They stopped feeding it, and it cooled, and it sank back down to wherever a thing like that waits. And it is still there, under a frozen sea that no aircraft has crossed low and slow in 70 years. And it is cold now, and it is patient, and it remembers the shape of what used to pass overhead, warm and bright and full of living heat. Go back with me, one last time, to that corridor. A single aircraft, low under a warmed ceiling, the cold sea beneath it, the cockpit filling with a heat that has no source. And alongside it, keeping pace, unhurried, a long, pale, ribboned body the length of 3 fuselages, glowing faintly from within, matched exactly to a speed it was never built to match, close enough that the man at the controls has opened his collar and is sweating over a frozen ocean, and it is not looking at his aircraft. It is looking at him. It stays for 4 minutes. And then, for reasons he was never able to name, it lets him go. They spent 60 years proving it was only warm air, and I keep coming back to the one question that all their proof steps carefully around, the question the survivor asked, and no one has answered since. If it was only warm air, what was the warmth for? What was it feeding? And when the last flyer turned away and the corridor went cold, where did it go, and what is it waiting to feel pass over it again?